Ronald Lee Steenhoek, and I was born in Prairie City, Iowa, June 27, 1944. When I went to college, the Vietnamese War was getting started, and I didn't really see that as a threat to my future, but as I progressed through college, I became increasingly aware of the fact that I was probably going to have to end up going. When I would interview with companies that came to campus to interview seniors at college, they would ask, first question is, what's your draft status? And when I said 1A, they would all say the same thing, well, call me when you get back. A lot of guys in that era were either trying to get to the National Guard or go to Canada. That wasn't an option for me. I didn't know anybody. If you knew a senator or some big shot, you could maybe get a letter referring you to the National Guard, but everybody had beat me to it. There were no guard positions available. Going to Canada was an option. You know, I did feel that I owed the country something, you know, like paying taxes, and they need you, so I'll serve. And I couldn't pick the war, you know, I could just pick the branch I went in. All the way through my senior year, virtually the whole year, I was exploring the Air Force. I graduated from Central College in Pella, so we would travel to Des Moines to visit recruiters, myself and 2 or 3 other seniors. And we would exclude either the Navy or the Army or the Marines, and for whatever reason I decided on the Air Force, partly because I thought it was going to avoid the infantry duty of the Army. So when I graduated, I was accepted into the flight training program as a pilot in the Air Force, and I also had a draft notice from my local draft board so that said, if you don't for some reason carry on with the Air Force as you're planning, then we want you to show up for your draft, for your induction. Everybody that graduates from flight school wants a fighter. They want to fly a jet fighter. And at that time it was an F-4 Phantom or an F-100. So if you elected an F-4, you were sent to school for an F-4, then you went to Vietnam for a year in the back seat of an F-4, then you came back and were checked out in the front seat, and then you might have to go back in the front seat flying an F-4. So that was a thing that people thought about, but it still didn't make any, it wasn't a big deterrent. A lot of people still opted for a fighter airplane first. Just about every airplane up on the board there was eventually headed to Vietnam. They would call it in the pipeline. You're either going to Tennessee for training, then Vietnam, or you're going to California for training, then Vietnam, Florida, and then Vietnam. But there were 2 airplane slots available to be a pilot on a C-118, which I didn't know what it was, but it was in the Panama Canal Zone for 3 years. And I said, that's for me. Our unit flew embassy support down to South America. So the various embassies around Central and South America would get supplies down to the Canal Zone, and then we would take them the rest of the way down to the embassy, whether it was in Santiago, Chile, Asuncion, Paraguay, Rio de Janeiro, wherever. So it was an exciting mission to be able to go all over South America, but when I first got started, it was very boring flying because a lot of it is just out over the ocean or just 6 hours straight and level, and you're just bored. But eventually, my 3 years got cut to 15 months because the Air Force came out with a program they called Palace Cobra. They gave the computer the job to identify all the Air Force pilots that had not been to Vietnam yet. And the logic was, we don't want to send somebody back twice when we have people that haven't been. So this computer sorted out all the pilots and found me hiding down there in the Canal Zone and said, aha, Ron is down in the Canal Zone, he hasn't been yet. So then Headquarters Air Force took all of those names and cut our tour short wherever we were to feed us into the system to go to Vietnam. So we have what you call a Form 90, which we referred to as a dream sheet. It's like, since you're going to Vietnam, put down your preferences so we can assign you to one of those. And the long and short of it is, when I put down my preferences, I submitted the paperwork, they sent it into the Headquarters Air Force, but in that transmission they made a mistake in the form. And so 2 or 3 months later they said, we have your orders for Vietnam, you want to come and get them? And so I did, and they said, you're going to Vietnam in a UH-1. And I said, what is that? And they looked it up and said, it's a helicopter. And I said, well, that can't be. I didn't put that anywhere on my Form 90. Well, they started checking, and they compared my draft copy of that Form 90 with their transmitted copy, and they said, oh, we made a mistake when we transmitted it. We transmitted that you volunteered for a helicopter in Vietnam. And I said, no, I didn't. Well, they said, it's too late to change. You're already, quote, in the pipeline. And then the military, in all of its wisdom, said, your orders say you're going to a transport unit and we don't know what that is, but you need to go to a gunship training school in Florida after your Wichita Falls, Texas training. And I said, well, if I'm going to a transport unit, what do I need to know how to fly a gunship? And so all during my 10 weeks at Wichita Falls, Texas, they were trying to resolve this issue. And at the end of my training, I said, well, I need to do something. I need to go to Florida for this training, or I need to go home and then get to Vietnam, one of the two. I need the training or not. And they said, we've got it figured out. You don't need the gunship training. So I assured my nervous wife, I'm not flying a gunship. I'm going to Vietnam, but it's a safe job flying generals around or flying Bob Hope around, something safe. But then school was over, and the next day everybody was going to get on an airplane and going to Vietnam, except for, and they read off about 10 names, and mine was one of the names. And I said, well, what am I staying behind for? Well, you'll know tomorrow morning. So, okay, well, it's one day less in Vietnam, I'll stay. So the next morning we went to this room we were supposed to go, and there were armed guards there checking everybody's clearance to make sure everybody that got in the room had a top secret clearance. And I thought, something strange here. And the purpose of that one-day class was to teach those of us they thought were the highest probability of getting captured and become a prisoner of war. It was to teach us a system on how to communicate to our wives via a letter and code on how to smuggle information back. And I'm thinking, this is not my idea, flying Bob Hope around. I'm going to be a POW. And it was purely because I was a helicopter pilot that I was selected for that. So then I went into Vietnam the next day, landed, went to the headquarters of this little transport unit and said, I'm here, Lieutenant Steenhoek reporting for duty. And they said, what do you do? And I said, I'm a helicopter pilot. And they said, we have trucks here and forklifts. We don't have any helicopter. I said, well, that's strange. Is there a helicopter gunship unit on this base? Oh, yeah, it's down the road. Let's call them. So I called them and I said, are you expecting a Lieutenant Steenhoek? Yeah, but not for a couple months. You're supposed to be in gunship training in Florida right now. I said, oh, no, I'm here. Send me back for the training. And they said, no, too much expense. We'll give you a little extra training here in country before we turn you loose. And then we're not sending you back, so you belong in our gunship unit. So then I had the difficult job of calling my wife at some point and saying, you know, that gunship unit I told you I wasn't in, I'm in it. So they normally give everybody that's been through the gunship training a couple of orientation rides in the area to get used to the terrain and the climate, and then they would turn you loose with a helicopter to do your job. And they said, we'll give you 10 lessons instead of 2, and that'll make up for the training you missed. Well, they only gave me 3. And then they said, we need you, so go get them. I went over in June, the middle of June of 1970. June 1 of 1970, prior to that, there'd been ground troops excursion into Cambodia. And it was such a public relations debacle here in the States that Nixon said, as of June 1, there will be no ground troops in Cambodia, no American ground troops in Cambodia. So these reconnaissance teams that our unit was supporting was all special forces guys. But as of June 1, that became South Vietnamese forces that were furnishing the reconnaissance teams, but we were still providing the air cover for the South Vietnamese teams instead of the special forces teams. So officially there were no ground troops in Cambodia. We were supposed to stay at least an inch off the ground. Every morning we'd get up, we'd have breakfast, we'd have a briefing, here's what we're going to do today. We've got 6 teams out, none of them are due to come out today, it should be a quiet day. And maybe it was quiet, or maybe one of these teams got stumbled onto by the enemy and we had to go get them. So we never knew. Or they'd say, today we're putting in a team early afternoon and we're pulling another team out late afternoon. So they'd tell us at this briefing what the deal is for the day. And then we'd go out to our helicopters and we'd take off and we would go set, we called it strip alert, at a little jungle clearing near the Cambodian border, like 2 to 5 miles away from the Cambodian border, but it was in South Vietnam at a little fire base. So when one of the teams went hot or got in trouble, we would scramble 2 helicopters and they would take off immediately. They were under the control of a forward air controller that was circling in a little light Cessna airplane, and he'd say, it's team number 7, they're in trouble. So we'd head to where we knew they were until we picked him up circling. He would describe the situation to us, tell us, okay, the bad guys are here, the good guys are here, and then we'd descend to the treetop level, firing as we came down and firing our guns to suppress any ground fire that was in the area. And then within 15 or 20 minutes of us taking off, the other two would take off, so that by the time we ran out of fuel or ammunition, they would be on location to do what we were doing. So the only people on our aircraft were a pilot, co-pilot, and two gunners, and they all were used to the rapid, I mean, you didn't have time to be sick. I don't know of anybody that ever got sick, but it was pretty violent flying. It was up and down and left and right and sudden, but we had to still maintain a semblance of this pattern, because we operated in pairs. Number two was following me, and I had to make sure that I was flying the pattern as published so that he could plan his pattern, because if I just flew my own improvised, he wouldn't know what to do. So there was a certain routine that I had to follow, plus or minus a few feet, so he knew. And the whole purpose of the pattern is so that when I crossed over the target, I could fire out the side, that side of the helicopter, at the bad guys, and when I got past them, I would execute a turn so that I could come back and do it again at the same time number two is coming by shooting. So he's shooting at them while I'm in my turn, and when I'm coming back, I'm ready to pick up when he goes into his turn. And then once we ascertained that they were neutralized, or they had run, or decided to hide, we would then call the other slick that was in the area to come and pick them up. And they would come and pick them up, and then we'd follow them out. It's usually in the morning when you're going out to the remote site, or in the evening when you come back and you think, ooh, that was close, or today could be the day. So you tended to be kind of fatalistic about your job, knowing it's not eat, drink, and get drunk because tomorrow we die type of mentality, but there is a certain amount of looseness and goofing off you do because you realize life is pretty cheap and it could be yours. So your values suffered because of the situation you were in, and life became quite cheap and you didn't trust anything. There were little kids walking out to soldiers asking to be picked up, and they had hand grenades taped under their armpits, so when the soldier bent low to pick up the kid, the hand grenade went off and blew up the kid and the soldier. Those were just routine happenings, and it became obvious to everybody around that life is cheap. And so you tend to almost become an animal if you let it. So the struggle is to maintain your sanity in spite of that situation. I'm not going to kill women and children unless my own life is really threatened. And that was my limit. I'm not shooting into women and children. I don't care whether I'm getting ground fire from them, I'm going to leave the area. But I understood people that didn't share that view. They've seen the darker side of what combat can be, and it wasn't pretty. I'm a fairly religious person, I guess. I believe that God created all people, and I come to realize these people had no more stake in the war than I did. They were being used. I was being used to accomplish the thing. They weren't guilty. They were forced to do it. They were innocent. For example, we did things like we would desire to have a practice area near an Air Force base, so we would drop leaflets in that area and saying, effective next Thursday, this is going to be a free fire area. Anybody found in this area could get hurt. So we just expected all the people that lived in that area to leave. And that makes sense if you use the Western mentality. If I knew that, I would say, well, I'll just go to Omaha for the week or whatever. I'll get out of here. But I come to realize from knowing the people and studying them a little bit that their ancestors were born there. Their very soul was tied to that property. They couldn't leave. But we came in with all of our wisdom and said, I'm sorry if you're there, you're fair game. And I found that a little bit hard to justify once I heard their culture is different than ours. So, I agreed, but I still, when I'm in the free fire zone, if I saw anybody, I had orders, we're not shooting at them. Even though this was toward the tail end of the war, I consider it toward the tail end. It was 70 and 71. It became obvious that there was a lot of deception going on by the military leaders and the politicians. I remember being in college hearing Lyndon Johnson saying, I see the light at the end of the tunnel. And that was in 67, whatever. And I remember Richard Nixon promising this war is about over, and it wasn't. And I saw generals trying to advance their own career at the expense of a lot of people getting hurt. Let's just commit these troops to this thing because it'll look good on my resume. So I had a pretty good perspective. My perspective was, we're here, we're obligated to follow orders, let's do it, but let's not take unnecessary risks. Let's don't hang it out for the country here and do something stupid. Let's make sure we're covered, let's make sure as many people get home safe as you can, but yet let's do the job. Let's don't run away from the job. Let's still get the job done as well as we can, but let's do it with some caution. There is a time to say, no, I can't do this. There's a time to say, let's go get them. And I tried to instill that in the guys I was training. During Vietnam, LBJ and Robert McNamara, who was the Secretary of Defense, they were all intimately involved in planning which targets to hit, what to do, and it was a political war. And we learned that you don't fight war that way. So that's another one of the lessons of Vietnam, is don't get in unless there's a strategy for winning and an exit strategy. So we're learning because of Vietnam that way too.